I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, how does a war imprint on the tender memories of a child? Dr. Johan Zwaan, in his deeply personal and poignant book, World War II and VI, A Kid's Memories of War and Postwar, opens the vault of his childhood recollections, painting a vivid picture of his experiences growing up in Holland during the tumultuous times of World War II. We're delighted to have Johan join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the team at Brookside Press for helping us put him in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support writers like him by subscribing to our channel. Johan, thanks so much for joining us here today on Spotlight. Our pleasure to have you here. Let's start out with the question about the book title, World War II and VI. What does that mean exactly?
Well, World War II is obviously.
Yeah.
I added the VI because I also talk in the book about my first 6 years after the war when I went to high school.
Gotcha. And those were important years, of course. Now, absolutely formative years as well. Tell me a little bit about why you decided to write the book.
Couple of reasons. Main reason was because my kids and grandchildren always ask questions about what was it like to live during the Nazi occupation. And I tried to answer them, but then finally when I retired, I had more time and in fact I was bored, I had something to do.
Yeah.
So I wrote a book, and I also did it to honor my parents.
And your kids asked the question, so I'll ask the question as well. What was it like living in Holland during World War II? How old were you when the war broke out, and what was your experience like?
I was 5 when it started, and I was 10, 5 years later, when we were liberated. And what it was like, it was kind of mixed. From year to year, it was sort of different. Once we were occupied, there was relatively speaking not much going on until 1942, when the persecution of the Jews started.
Yeah.
And started with excluding them from things. They could no longer go to a theater, to a swimming pool, to a restaurant. So they were more and more isolated. And then they started picking people up, and to my dismay to the present, the Dutch police really cooperated with it. In fact, they were often the ones who got people from their home and sent them on to Amsterdam before they were transported to Germany, to the camps where they were destroyed, basically. So, and the other thing that we changed, according to the years, was that the air got busier. More planes flying over from England to bomb Germany, because my little town is on the north bank of the main branch of the Rhine River, and it was just like a road going into Germany.
Yeah.
So there were more fights in the air. The Germans tried to catch them down with their fighter jets, and they had no jets until the end of the war. And it got busier and busier. People got shut down, and my dad, who was a family physician, was active in the underground. So when the personnel of a plane would land, usually by parachute, sometimes with the plane still more or less intact, And the underground tried to get there as quick as possible so that they could hide them from the Germans who would send them to a concentration camp. Now, at the time, I didn't really know much about what my dad did because obviously, for security reasons, he was not going to tell his 7-year-old and younger kids what they were doing. It's just too dangerous. So much of this I didn't find out until after the war. And then, of course, the Allied offensive very rapidly came closer and closer to the south border of the river, the Rhine River, and the Germans became really afraid that they would come across the river at that point. So all the houses around the neighborhoods of the river were evacuated. Everybody was kicked out, basically. And I remember that very well. We had to leave our house, and then for the winter of 44, 45, we slept in a space that my dad had found with one of his patients, of basically a suite of 2 rooms, and occasionally use of the kitchen. And that was quite an ordeal because by that time there were 5 kids. The youngest one, the only sister that we had, was born on Christmas Day in 1943. And things became kind of difficult. Food was scarce, although lucky that my little town was in the middle of an agricultural area, so much of the farms around, you could go there and get food if you had something to trade with them. You know? My dad, for instance, took his typewriter that he used in the practice for his medical records and traded it with a farmer, maybe 5 kilometers away from our home. And he got a big bag with grain. And that's where we lived from, because most of the food wasn't available anymore. And before that, in 1943, my dad was called to the headquarters of the German army in Rotterdam, about 25, 30 miles away, because he was considered hostile to the Germans. German friendly, as it's called. And never came back. Okay? So my mother got really worried, and she found a friend, car dealer, who still had a car available, and he drove her to Rotterdam to the headquarters. And my dad had been found guilty of that, and was to be sent to a concentration camp for 3 months. My mother was in her early 30s at the time. And with my dad disappearing, and 4 young boys, who were all born, all 4 were from 1934 for me to 1938 for my youngest brother, and then a baby on top of that. She are expecting a baby on top of that. I still don't understand how she kept it all together. No, of course, in those days, people had maids, and she had a young girl in the house, partially to train her and partially just as a helper. And that helped. And for her, it must have been a very difficult time, more difficult than I understood as a child then. So, but she never let know how worried she must have been about all this. Young woman, 4 children, a 5th one on the road, war going on around her, food being scarce, and the older I have become, the more I have admired her for keeping it all together all by herself. So overall, it was a tough time, much tougher than as a child. I realized the last winter of the war, 1944, 1945, became known as the Hunger Winter. Because in the western part of the country, where the big cities are, people really died because of hunger. They ate tulip bulbs, anything they could find. And there was no heat anymore, there was no electricity anymore. The gas in our small city was closed off, so you couldn't cook. So I realized that it was tough. We had a big bag of wheat at least. So my task as an oldest kid was to grind it up in an old coffee mill to make flour out of it so that my mother could bake bread. Right. And she was very inventive and put she on it, so we all survived.
Yeah. When it comes to survival, that's when you get inventive. That's when you start using every resource you have. That's when, a child becomes a man at a young age because he has to, right?
No question about it.
Yeah.
I remember 2 of my brothers, number 2 and number 3, going up to the wall of the city and chopping down a whole tree. Not a big tree, but maybe 10 yards high or something like that. And pulling it into the house, into the corridor of the house where they evacuated. And that was fuel for a while. And I was not such a hero, but they also stole the wood out of the trenches that had been built in the wall by the Germans, or mostly by forced labor, that allowed them to cover a very wide field all across the city and towards the river if fighting would occur. Luckily, it never happened. So, those are kind of the main points. And then my dad came back from the concentration camp towards late in 1943. My mother was very pregnant by that point. And he, as a family physician, delivered the baby in the middle of the night of Christmas 1943. Wow. And he was so excited because there was only the girl and the only boys. He called the florist out of bed in order to buy some flowers for her. found that there were no flowers available. So he bought a Christmas wreath, brought that home and hung it in the bedroom with my mom.
Wonderful. These are all incredible stories that you tell. Some, of course, are heartbreaking. Others are heartwarming. They're all contained in Dr. Johan Zwaan's book, World War II and VI, A Kid's Memories of War and Post-War. It is an incredible book. It is an incredible read. And we're delighted to have the doctor join us here today on Spotlight. Doctor, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. And to the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.